welcome to another Scots Way podcast. And today I'm joined by musician Douglas MacIntyre, filmmaker Grant McPhee, and journalist Neil Cooper to talk about their new book, Hungry Beat, the Scottish Independent Pop Underground Movement, 1977 to 1984. Hello, Douglas, Grant, and Neil.
Hi.
Hi, Alistair.
Hi, Alistair. Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure. I feel kind of bad. I feel that each of you deserve a full podcast on your own for me to talk to you because of what the stuff you've done with Grant's films and your music and Neil's journalism. So maybe that's something we could look at a later date. But for now, it's great to have you all on, and it's great to talk about Hungry Beat. Douglas, first of all, can you tell us how Hungry Beat came about and what it's about?
Okay, well, how it came about was Grant had made an amazing documentary film called Big Gold Dream, which sort of chronicled, I guess, fast product moving through into postcards and beyond. So Grant and his team had amassed, substantial amount of interview content, and obviously there's only a certain amount could appear in the film. So I just felt like it was a really good opportunity to try and present a book edition. And I mean, I'm a really big fan of the John Savage book, England's Dreaming, and the Clinton Hayton From the Velvets to the Voidoids. And I think when you hear, as an oral history, when people are using their own words, to me, it feels like it's more powerful than if it's an academic overview. Yeah. So I was trying to not make it overly dry and to try and focus on, I think, the continuation of the work that Grant had done. So that's largely where we picked up on it.
I think you're absolutely right about the way it's written, because it offers lots of different viewpoints, sometimes on the same people in the same events, which kind of gives it, rather than just there being one point of view, there is multiple points of view. Mm-hmm. And Grant, you had all of this interview stuff. Did you ever think it would be used for something else, or did you just think that would end up on the cutting room floor?
No, I think, at some point wanted something to happen with them. And the way we made the film, it was like very talking heads, heavy, and, it really suited itself to the format. Our sort of blueprint was The World at War, the Second World War film, where everything's like primary sources. And, we had maybe 45 minutes of like interview in the film when you cut in music and archive and so on. And, we had, I can't remember, it must be like well over 150 hours worth of interview material. And, we could probably make another couple of books, which could be dangerous. But it just felt like, something was good. And when Douglas and I met during the making of Big Gold Dream, and it got on really well. And this is just something that came up, a few years later. It was always in the back of my mind, and Douglas just instigated it, which was like fantastic. It just felt that there was so much more to this story to be told, and it seemed to work out well.
And Neil, how did you become involved with the book?
Well, I mean, Douglas and Grant asked me, some way into it. It was pretty much a done deal before I got involved. And then I did some new interviews and a couple of other things. And that was it, really. I knew Douglas and Grant for a good few years, interviewed them for various things about Big Gold Dream, about Creeping Bent, and all of that. So I'm aware of the history, and obviously I was into that whole milieu anyway. And so it just seemed like a really good fit. I think. I hope so anyway.
So the interviews in the book, the majority come from Grant's interviews, it sounds like, but there's also some new ones, and I feel there's also some older ones as well, some archive.
Yeah, I think it's been said that a lot came from Big Gold Dream, but Douglas and Neil did nearly, it's like half the amount of them in the book, and a lot were revisited as well. It's not just Big Gold Dream. There's a vast amount of new material in there as well.
And what's having read it, it's kind of seamless, which I suppose is a good thing. You can't tell where which has come from where. It was an interesting book for me because I kind of knew the postcard story, but I didn't really know the Fast product records story. And is that just me being parochial Western Scots, or do you think that's the case, that the Fast story hasn't been as widely told as a postcard?
It's part of the East-West dynamic that probably runs through the book as well. But I think the Fast product and pop oral story hasn't really had the same voice as postcard, just for various reasons. And again, to go back to Grant's film, I think that addressed the balance to a certain extent. And, you know, they were all really important. They were all different. They all had their particular, you know, features. So, yeah, I mean, I think most people, I mean, like you, Alistair, I'm West Coast, so it just felt because it was on our doorsteps, postcard, there was so much more that was accessible to us. And also, I was just a wee bit young for the Fast product movement as it was happening, but I did go through to all the gigs.
Right.
So, you know, I would regularly go through to Valentino's and to JJ's to watch all of these bands. So, but yeah, I think both labels and the dynamics around them are fascinating, and it's I think it's really important that they were documented.
Well, I think that's one of the great things about Big Gold Dream is that, for me, I knew some of the band names, but I didn't know that there was this record label in Edinburgh which was so influential, not just in Edinburgh, but, you know, far wide. And we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Neil, what do you feel about that? Do you feel that one story has been favoured or told more often than the other?
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure why that is, but you know, I mean, growing up as well, you know, I grew up in Liverpool and picked up on postcards and Fast when I was a teenager, and there was something kind of, I suppose, more immediate in a way, that it's a postcard for all its cheek and its ambition and all the great things that came out of Orange Juice, Aztec Camera, Joseph K, and of course the Go-Betweens. Fast, there was something more, I don't know, I suppose, mysterious about it, because there was this whole spate of inverted commas regional labels like Factory in Manchester, Zoo in Liverpool, Postcard in Glasgow. Yes, Fast was Edinburgh, but there was a kind of internationalism to it, if you like. You know, even like its last single, with putting the dead Kennedys out, you know, but then it went beyond its doorstep. You know, it didn't have to go very far from its doorstep, because, you know, it was run from the street next door to Edinburgh College of Art. But it was a while before they even put out a record by an Edinburgh band, which of course was the Scars. You know, yeah, it looked beyond its doorstep, I suppose, with Mekons and Gang of Four and all that. So it wasn't as easy to grab hold of. And there was the art to it, you know. I mean, it wasn't really a record label. It was kind of, it was an art concept put into record sleeves.
Yeah, I mean, it's often compared to what Andy Warhol was doing in the Factory and with those kind of things. And Grant, as a filmmaker, when you came to make your film, did you feel that was it easier to access material on the postcard side of things rather than Fast?
To be very political here, in terms of material in what was available online at the time we did it, which was like, you know, at that time the internet was like incredibly important to like making contacts. There was a lot of stuff research-wise on postcards, and you know, I think that's like quite interesting with like Wikipedia. A lot of these online journals can be quite lazy, and the references are references to things which are online. So it's very easy for somebody or something to be lost. And it felt that accessing anything Fast products related like online, it's like quite difficult in terms of accessing the people involved. Fast side, the Edinburgh side was like a dream. You know, we met up with Malcolm Ross from Joseph K straight away, and it was him who told me about the Scars, a band I'd never heard of. And you know, this was just a whole new world opening up to me. Likewise, you know, with yourself, Postcard was like my introduction to the Scottish music, and it became almost like a sort of puzzle, but one person would link to somebody else. And in terms of researching, old school wise, picking up a telephone and speaking to people, it was very easy to get anything sort of fast and Edinburgh related. I think possibly because the story hadn't been told, or fallen a little bit to the wayside, which is quite unfair, I thought, and it felt like it was like a duty to get that story told.
Well, that's the really interesting part to me, because there's lots of things I didn't know, like the release of The Dead Kennedys, a record I had, but I didn't realise that's who had put it out. The link with the Human League, at least, that was fascinating to see that you've got this kind of strand of things going. And Douglas, you mentioned about going through for gigs. And of course, in Glasgow, there weren't really punk gigs happening because the council kind of shut it down. So people, I think it feels to me that punk had a much stronger importance, a bigger importance in Edinburgh than it did in Glasgow, maybe for that reason.
I think in Glasgow, there was a real, punk was absolutely absorbed in Glasgow, but it didn't really have the same outlets that I think Edinburgh had. And very quickly, in most of these cities like Manchester, what was punk lasted a very short period of time, and it moved on to something beyond. Most of the Scottish, artists or labels from Edinburgh and Glasgow were probably more fascinated by Vic Goddard and the Subway Sect, for example, than the Damned. So it became more of a. It just became something. There was a desire for it, a need for it, and I think that was true in Glasgow as well. It just didn't really have the outlets until a few years later, when probably a scene started in the Bungalow Bar, which in Paisley, which again was a continuation of what had happened with the punk rock hotel there. And
that's one of the things in the book, is the importance of places for people to go and play, and even gigs. There's kind of seminal gigs that it seems that a lot of people were at, or and we'll talk a bit about some of those. Is one of them The Clash? Is that right about that?
Yeah, I mean, The Clash White Riot tour, when it played Edinburgh on the 7th of May 1977, is, infamously when most of the people that became the main protagonists in Fast Product and Postcard, and the people that formed bands, they were all at that gig. But rather than The Clash being the band that really ignited them, it was like the Slits and and the Subway Sect, and I think there's a lot of importance also due to John Peel, because the work that was done by him and John Walters in getting the Subway Sect recorded, and the Slits and the Prefects. I mean, those recordings are defining. By the time Subway Sect released an album, it didn't really have any bearing on their first Peel session. So there was a lot of fanzines were really important. Peel was really important, and just trying to find out what was happening and trying to connect with some of the gigs that were happening was, it was hard work. It wasn't laid on a plate for you. You had to work hard to find out what was happening.
I think that is interesting in itself. The fact, if you wanted to read about this music, you almost had to, do it yourself, like Bobby Bluebell doing his own fanzine, which I didn't know about either. And there was it was the DIY aesthetic, if you like, ran through everything. It wasn't just the people making music, it was the people putting the records out, it was the people putting the fanzines out, it was the people with their record shops.
I mean, to me, it was an incredibly important cultural period for youth, for young people, for teenagers and people in their early 20s. It just felt there was something in the air, that there was something happening, and it was ignited by punk. But I think for that period in Scotland, there was lots of different cultural impetus, that I think resulted in things like Michael Clark coming through, some years later, and even with an older generation, like Alistair Gray, Lanark being published. It just felt there was a lot of different things happening that all seemed to feed into each other, and all seemed to establish more of a confidence in being Scottish rather than being ashamed of being Scottish culturally, which was largely the case, I think.
Neil, that's an interesting point. How did you view the Scotland of that time with this new music coming out, new writers coming out as well?
Well, I mean, it was quite important. I mean, picking up on Orange Juice and Aztec Camera. I mean, it had its influence in Liverpool on bands. I mean, I saw Orange Juice, and the only time I saw them, I mean, they were supported by the Pale Fountains, the Wild Swans, both doing their debut gigs. And then a couple of months later, Aztec Camera played and supported again by the Pale Fountains. So there seemed to be a synergy there, I think. Again, it was this kind of mutual energy that was happening in cities outside London, I think, where people were kind of seizing the means of productions, whether it be through fanzines or record labels or forming bands or whatever, as Douglas has said, and just kind of just doing it. But there was this synergy of I don't know, trying to almost demachify, if that's a word, the kind of city life and make something much more imaginative that was going on in the kind of post-punk environment anyway. I think. I mean that it all came from it. And as Douglas said, I mean, you got your information. It genuinely felt kind of alternative. It's a much overused word now, I think, but and in a pre-internet era, going to a record shop on a Saturday afternoon, that was the gateway into a whole new world, whether it's a record or a poster on the wall or an advert or a fanzine, and that was the thing. But all the places were connected.
Yeah, that's what was really interesting as well, that you had all these indie record labels who weren't kind of fighting against each other for most of the time. There's some exceptions, but that were actually learning from each other. Factory from Fast and Zoo from Postcard and all of those things.
Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, there was an energy, and I think there was something there that was a hangover as well from the hippie era. Although Richard Branson and Virgin became what that became. Even at punk time, into the major labels, let's not forget that the Human League and the Mekons, all fast product acts, signed to Virgin, and it was Virgin who had spent the 70s kind of through Mike Oldfield to Faust and people like that kind of underground progness. And picking up on the punk and the post-punk in that really interesting period that Douglas is talking about. So but that hangover of being able to do things, I think fed into punk as well. Although the idea of it felt very. Things livened up with punk and post-punk, I think, and the whole kind of hippie thing had grown tired, but there was a spirit of openness, I think, that people slightly older, like Bill Drummond or Bob Last or Hilary Morrison or Tony Wilson, they kind of got the dregs of the hippie era and fed that into their own visions.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because you always get the feeling from the outside that you had your kind of year zero with punk and what came before was discarded. But then as time went on, people started to say, well, actually, I did like Van der Graaf Generator or something like that. I could find stuff in that. And going back to, as you say, having people making the things for themselves, Grant, did you find that there was a lot of, when you were doing the film and for the book, a lot of archive that you could go and deal with, physical stuff?
It was actually very difficult. Nowadays, if you miss a gig, you can go into YouTube and you'll have like about 5-10 people uploading what you missed online. And for us, you had probably the closest thing to an iPhone would be like a Super 8 camera, and that was still a luxury for a lot of people. And so there was really very little archive at the time. And when you're making a documentary, obviously one of the most engaging things is like archive footage of like bands. We had fantastic photography archive, like Hilary from Fast, Hilary Morrison, like a fantastic photographer, so that was great. And as Neil and Douglas both said, a lot came out of punk, not just music. and photographers were a big part of that. And there's some fantastic photographers. Robert Sharp is one of the most well-known documenters of like postcards, like through his photography, and it really is fantastic. That part was easy. When it came to accessing more sort of like BBC orientated sort of material, once they started getting a bit more famous, that was difficult, because that gets into sort of licensing restrictions. And our film was like made completely independently, and we didn't have the luxury to be able to license everything, so we relied on a lot of goodwill from people. So it is, it's like fascinating for me just finding anything of that era. Fanzines really were, I think, the way that era is like brought to life beyond the obviously the records themselves.
Now, there's a quote from Bob Last. There's a lot of quotes from Bob Last in the book, but one that says that this was, a lot of the bands he was dealing with were intellectuals playing simple music, which kind of struck me. Do you think he's right about that? Or was that just a kind of, there's a lot of throwaway lines as well from both him and Alan Horn. They're very good at that kind of thing. But what do you think about that idea?
I think there was a lot of raw intelligence. Whether that's the same as intellectuals, I'm not entirely sure. But young people were really, they were really searching for something. And I think that's the influence of punk. It was very much, we're anti-ignorance. That's one of Joe Strummer's great phrases, I think, with the Clash. And anti-ignorance was a big thing. It was like you were really keen to find out, well, who's Andy Warhol? He's a guy that does the cans. Well, what else has he done? So you would research it yourself through books or whatever. Everyone was reading. You go to the Bungalow Bar in Paisley to see a band, and everyone had their Jean-Paul Sartre Nausea copy with them. So even though a lot of that would be a pose, it was just the fact that, well, that's a pose as opposed to what happened when Oasis broke through. It felt like there was a real questing spirit with young people, and just a raw intelligence. I think one of the things Bob does talk about in the book is particularly, with Robert King and Davy Henderson from Scars and from Fire Engines, and just that absolute natural, raw intelligence that was born of being inquisitive. And trying to make things up, trying to, it's almost like amusing yourselves by creating stuff, making things up.
Yeah, I mean, this is it. This is what kind of punk and post-punk kind of opened up. And as Douglas has said, I mean, it was kind of that whole generation. They weren't expected to do any of these things, but they did it anyway. I mean, there was the gateway through the music, and as Douglas said, it opens up to books, to art, to everything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And near the end of the book, you start to get Lloyd Cole getting referenced, and their Rattlesnakes album is a classic example of that. It's just filled with reference and image. And Grant, you mentioned Hilary Morrison, who's central to the Fast story anyway. Could you maybe talk a little bit about her?
Well, Derek, I'm all right just to backtrack just a second about the rudimentary music. I think what is interesting about that is I think there was like two skills. I think postcards were very much making rudimentary music, but wanting to make chic-like records. And I think Bob was very interested in actual rudimentary music, almost like outsider art, with signing up like an 11-year-old Adamski playing ukulele with his little brother. But there's so many talented musicians who came out of that scene. It was obviously people like Pete DeFreitas, the drummer from Echo and the Bunnymen, and I think that's somebody who would just never have come into music if it wasn't for punk. People like Malcolm Ross, a fantastically gifted guitarist. So I think rudimentary is, I think, quite unfair. It allowed people to pick up instruments to play something which they hadn't becoming it's like the attitude, but also some fantastic musicians really did come out of that scene, which they probably never would have come to, because everyone was so into the cliche of like playing like somebody in
Haunted
yes,
the truth, that kind of thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
But Hillary is somebody who is like fascinating. I think, as I mentioned earlier on, it's like very easy in this modern age for references to reference something of the near past, and Wikipedia is like really is terrible for that. And Bob is quite an interesting person, and I think that one of the reasons like Fast was seen laterally as like a footnote is because he didn't promote himself in the same way that a lot of the other impresarios did. And what was written about Bob, or Fast should say, was Bob. And Hillary really was a huge part of Fast. She was Bob's partner at the time. And I think, as is mentioned in the film or the book, it's difficult to tell, they all merge into one, that she was like referred to as like the heart of Fast. I think that is important. I don't think Bob was into what is like in inverted commas like down on the street, whereas like Hillary, being the same age as people like Davy and Rab, were. And I think it was like her that brought a lot of the Scottish bands like to Fast.
Right.
And I think she is as much Fast as Bob was.
Well, that's interesting, because there's not a lot of women in the book, and there's Claire Grogan, Alison Gourley, Strawberry Switchblade, Faye Fife. Was that just the time it was, or was the Scottish indie music scene kind of mostly a boys' game, to put it that way?
Tricky. I think Douglas and Neil will be able to give better answers, but it's very interesting. We've tried to create the story, from my perspective, as true to life as it was. In my naivety at first, I just assumed that with punk the barriers would have like opened up like equally, and Hillary has some like very interesting like quite dark tales that that just didn't happen. And it was quite often just the same people. It was like young males, and more worryingly the sort of like older people in the record industry who just didn't see female fronted bands in the same way. And that's why I think there are very few female fronted bands who are like signed up. There's some fantastic bands like the Twin Sets and Ets from Edinburgh and Sophisticated Boom Boom in Glasgow, but for whatever reason the year zero moment then to me didn't seem to break into actually signing these female bands up, which is a shame.
Douglas, what was your thoughts on that?
Well, I think probably from the book's perspective, we did focus more on the artists that were signed. And obviously there were far fewer female musicians that were part of that. I think one of the question marks, in retrospect, I feel I should probably we should have discussed a bit more was the bands that Grant just mentioned there, because Sophisticated Boom Boom in Glasgow, I thought, were a big band.
Yeah,
and their Peel sessions were great, and I used to go and see them a lot, and they just felt the exact same as the other bands. I suppose the big difference was, for whatever reason, nobody put any records out by them at the time, which is crazy when you listen to the Peel sessions. It just, and from going to see them live at the time, it just felt a bit crazy. But I guess that was we did focus more on the artists that were actually signed. But it was as Grant said, it was a true reflection of what was happening then.
Yeah, I know it feels like that, because you mentioned the influence of people seeing the Slits play live. But having read a lot of Ev Albertine's memories of the time, there was problems there. That was problematic.
Yeah. I mean, I think those problems. There was this feeling that punk, let's remember, it did break down massive barriers, because suddenly you've got Tina Weymouth, any amount of musicians who are in bands. They weren't just the vocalists, and and the Slits in particular, and others, the Modettes, there were lots of bands with with female musicians, and that felt normal. Prior to punk, it felt like it was a gimmick.
Yeah.
There's the Velvet Underground, they've got a female drummer. Ha ha. There was a bit of that attitude, I think, with the rock critic orthodoxy. But punk did change that. But I think in terms of the business still was pretty sexist and repugnant in terms of that, I think, to be honest.
Well, you kind of get new music, but the old business model still.
I think that's it. I think within the younger people that were moving forward, it did feel like year zero. But obviously, to take what they were doing to market effectively, they had to still interact with record labels, and some of the record labels, particularly established larger labels, it was kind of old school.
Yeah.
And old school. It's tough for us talking about this because we're not females and we're seeing this from a male trying to see it from a female's perspective. And I think Carol Easton's making a fantastic film since yesterday, which hopefully will address a lot of this and fill in a lot of gaps that we've not covered. And I think it's going to be a really important film.
I agree. I'm really looking forward to seeing that as well. Well, we've talked about Fast, but let's talk a bit about a Postcard as well. Do you feel that Fast begat Postcard, or was it always going to happen anyway?
Well, I think, Orange Juice, when they made their first even before the single, they made some recordings. They sent them to Zoo to try and get a record deal, and they'd sent them to majors. So, they were trying to figure out a way of making records, and I think probably the influence of Fast was important for everyone. It obviously influenced Factory, and as the book mentions, there was a lot of dialogue with Tony Wilson and Bob Last. So I think probably Postcard could see, well, if they can release records on their own, why can't we try and do likewise? And I think the canny move in all of that was Alan Horn figuring out, let's get another band, let's get an Edinburgh band and a Glasgow band, because if it had just been Orange Juice, it would have felt very much like a self-release type label. Whereas having Joseph K and Orange Juice, it was almost like they were the yin and yang. It was the cowboy and the Indian. It felt very like there were darker sides. The Joseph K was the darker side of Orange Juice, etc. So I think that was a smart move, and that gave it a massive amount of momentum, which was a simple thing to do, but it was a really clever thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And although you do get the sense throughout that Alan, was in love with one band and the other kind of tolerated a bit, which is an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you to speak to people in Joseph K, they probably felt they had to tolerate being treated like that in order to get the records out. But yeah, I guess that's just the way it was. It's an unusual, unorthodox way of referring to your bands, I think.
One of the things, like with both labels, I think, is that, and a lot of the labels at that time, was that they, for a kid buying their records and reading about this stuff, it seemed much bigger than it actually was, because of the ambition and the style and the kind of maybe arrogance even of it. It just it did appear like it was Postcard of Records of Scotland. It did appear like it was Motown. You didn't realize that these things were being put together in somebody's flat in the West End of Glasgow, and people putting in the sleeves and being felt tipped in. You didn't realize that these people were on the dole, and that because that was, I don't know, it was an alternative, and it just seemed much bigger and much fresher.
And I think for me that was in a lot of the music of Postcard as well. It was kind of widescreen, it was something different. When you think, I was brought up in Cambuslang, and you think, the boy up the road, Ainscow Bride's making that music, this huge thing, and his cowboy fringe jacket and the style and everything. And you're right, it seemed much bigger than just you know, folk of similar minds getting together and sticking labels on records.
Yeah, and yes. I mean, the whole scene was like that. It was like, you know, I mean, you're speaking about Roddy Frame there, obviously.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously he was a genius player from a very early age.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot of the others, you know, and I would include Malcolm in a genius player as a genius player as well. But a lot of it was sort of aspiring to sound like Chic or the Velvet Underground or some unholy marriage between the two, or like Parliament or Funkadelic or that, but not maybe having the chops to be able to play it and it coming out inverted commas wrong, and it fusing together to make something brand new.
And
is that dialectics?
it could be. It could be. And what comes across, because you've got this relatively short time period, but the change in the music, I think particularly with Postcard, is quite astonishing. You know, I always think back to how long it took the Blue Nile to make a record, but, you know, the second Stone Roses album or whatever. And you've got this period of time, and it comes across in the music of Simple Minds as well, where they change quite dramatically in that time. And is that something, Grant, that you were interested in, or did you have a clear cutoff where you went, right, I don't want to look at the music after this point?
No, I think it is fascinating, and it's very like the 1960s when you listen to something from 1961, like Del Shannon's Runaway, to something from 1965, like Beatles' Ticket to Ride. It is like a lifetime of difference, and then to something like from 1970, and this period which we've covered, I think is very similar. If you listen to like something from 1977, it's like just 3 chords thrashing away, but then by 1978, just like a year later, you have like some fantastic interesting stuff, and that's when I think it was the doors had opened. And people, I think as Malcolm Ross said, the slate had been wiped clean, and people started experimenting. I think post-punk is a kind name for maybe something like punk prog or whatever it is. It's just, from having very limited recording budgets, what people could achieve within that, and obviously as the 80s progressed, technology progressed and budgets increased, that technology came into force. So from something like 1977 to, let's say like 1978, from being buoyant using primitive electronics to like Dare, it's like a world difference. And then up to the Strawberry Switchblade album and the Wind singles produced by David Motion. It's like everything in the studio sort of thrown in. It is like a fascinating change, and I think, as like Neil and Douglas have both alluded to, it's that aspirations had changed as well. People could believe that they could do more. I think at first it's just like getting up and playing the guitar, and then it was like, actually, hold on, but we can do something that can compete with everybody else. And to me, that's like a fascinating and powerful thing, and these people did. But Stritty Blitti had Miles Davis playing with them, like 7 years after they were like sitting in a squat. That's insane.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, did it feel like that at the time, Douglas, when you were involved? I'm kind of thinking, particularly the music of Davy Henderson jumps out at me, going from the Fire Engines to doing Win and, this incredible pop production. Did you feel that things were changing almost on a weekly basis?
I think things did change remarkably because, with Postcard, I felt there was a real ambition there with Postcard, and to a certain extent, I felt that Postcard became Technicolor. I think there was a word you used earlier on, and it's almost like someone had switched on a colour television, and Postcard were looking forward, although they were looking backwards to the Buffalo Springfield and the Birds to move forward. But it created a real forward momentum, and it became the single biggest influential label for that short period of time. Everything changed very, very quickly from from their first single through to, you know, Orange Juice's first single through to their final one, Poor Old Soul. It felt like it was a massive journey, and it was a journey where their intelligence and their ability to sell themselves to the music press was fascinating. You know, I mean, they got everyone jumping on planes to come up to Glasgow to talk to them. You know, and that's, I think, one thing that you could really say Alan Horn had I think a big leap on Bob last. You know, Bob was good at playing the press, but Alan, I think, was incredible. You know, he really made, you know, he made people want to know more about Postcard, more about what's the next band on Postcard, what's happening, you know, who are these Bluebells. So, for example, as soon as the Bluebells or the you know, the Jazzeteers became, you know, part of Postcard, although they didn't release on the label, suddenly they're getting, you know, the Bluebells are on the front page of the Melody Maker, and they're on the Ogre Whistle Test, and the Jazzeteers are in all the music press. Albeit it was largely Alan that was doing their interviews for them, but it was, but you know, that was the power that I think Postcard had.
Yeah.
And you just feel that, you know, they probably just naturally ran out of steam, but it felt like they could have taken it up a level if they'd retained their confidence.
That's interesting to hear, because reading it, it feels as though it would be quite frantic near the end. There was so many ideas being thrown about, and the changes, the Jazzeteers or the Bourgeois or the, you know, all of those changes. And I just wondered, being in the middle of that, whether that was a little bit discombobulating.
Well, I mean, to me as a fan, you know, I feel I was pretty much viewing it from externally. Right. It felt to me that, and you know, this is alluded to in the book as well, I think when Orange Juice moved to a major, it changed everything. And it really, I think thereafter, because Bob had always encouraged the fast bands to sign to majors. Yeah. I think when Orange Juice did that, everyone else that was still on the label were thinking, and Alan Horn himself were thinking, let's reposition ourselves and become a production company and try and make records and license them to majors. So to answer your question with the Fire Engines, the Fire Engines, I think, were a complete movement unto themselves almost. Right. But when that finally stopped, there was definitely an idea of entryism. Everyone wanted to buy in. Right. to mainstream success, and I think that comes back to Bob taking the Human League from being this experimental electronic band to being #1 throughout the world. So everyone else is thinking, why can't we do that? Yeah. And it became hip to be on a major as opposed to being on an independent. And that was, you know, when I met the Jazzeteers when I moved to Glasgow, and I remember they were making a record for Rough Trade at the time, and they were a wee bit disparaging about Rough Trade. I mean, I don't know if they were repeating something they'd heard elsewhere, but it kind of just struck me as, you know, Rough Trade are an amazing label. You know, you've got the Go-Betweens and Aztec Camera on there. Why would you be slightly negative about it? But it was because they wanted to sign a major deal, which they ultimately did with Bourgeois. But everyone was trying to sign a major deal, and being on a major was hip. Being on Rough Trade wasn't hip.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And Neil, as a music fan at the time, did you consider such a thing? I don't think I did. I mean, I knew there was Postcard bands and I liked them, but I still liked them when they were releasing records on major labels as well.
Yeah, I mean, it did change things, I think. I mean, you know, I was a sort of indie purist in a way, and, you know, was barely discovering the whole kind of independent DIY aesthetic before that move to that kind of entryist move into the major labels. But so there was a difference, I guess. I suppose what it changed was that kind of slight exclusivity or rarity. It's like, this is mine. Yeah. You know, this is my little corner, and that. But now it's the world's. So, you know, one minute you're buying Being Boiled and Dignity of Labour EPs in the kind of rack in Probe Records in Liverpool, and the next there's posters for Dare everywhere. You know, I mean, that thing, it's like, okay. And I didn't know the ins and outs, how these things were working. You know, I knew there was something there to do with fast still, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was at the time. So it did change things, but you know, everything was happening so fast, and people were doing their growing up in public, I suppose, both the bands and the managers, and maybe that's why they run out of steam, you know. And you know, and once you get into the big label big label world, it's like, yes, that entryism is a wonderful ideal, but there's also the danger of being consumed by it as well, which has happened. So many, you know, fell by the wayside with.
I think it's maybe the difference between being a music fan and being a musician yourself, whereas the musician wants to do and take things as far as we can, whereas sometimes we have a really pure idea about how things should be, which is probably really unfair, I have to say. But so let's go back to the structure of the book, because what it does is offer up all sorts of different perspectives, as I said at the beginning, which is a really healthy way, I think, of reading it, because well, let's take Alan Horn as a divisive figure. You know, get some people saying one thing about him, and then other people kind of think, oh no, maybe it wasn't like that after all. Was that something, Grant, that you want to do with your film and with the book, or was it just the way that it happened?
I think, as I mentioned earlier on, the World at War, you know, wasn't being facetious. That actually was a huge influence, because I think there's something so truthful about somebody giving their own perspective on something about their own life, rather than having somebody talk for them. But as you know, somebody mentioned in one of my other films, it's like a crime scene reconstruction, because you know, with the expanse of time and everybody's interpretation of what happened, you know, nobody remembers anything in the same way. And you know, when we ask questions, you know, like for the book and like for the film, where we ask 20 people the same question, and you have maybe 15 people giving you a very, very similar answer, which is, you know, probably excused by time and ravages of youth, and then other people have a completely different interpretation. That's you know, you have to ask questions like why they do that, and for our narrative, you know, we have to think, you know, why is that person saying that? You know, how will a reader interpret that? But I think, as I said, you know, there is something very truthful about somebody giving their own interpretation, and you know, while we have drawn some lines in the story, I think it's up to the reader for them to interpret in their own way.
You know, I think that's exactly what it does. It leaves you open to saying, well, this is as full of pictures I'm going to get from other people, but it's up to you to decide how you view events and all of those things. But Douglas, were you worried that there would be any negative feedback from people that are still around and some of them making music?
Not really, because I mean, everything that we did, I mean, we're all fans, so we're coming from the perspective of, you know, we really love these records, we love these labels, we love the artists and the people that are involved in bringing these records to people's attention. So we just tried to tell the, you know, to allow the people to tell the story in their own words as much as possible. So, you know, I think if there's obviously, as you mentioned, there are different people of conflicting memories or viewpoints, but that's healthy. And I think we consciously tried to remain, and I think we succeeded in remaining neutral throughout, and just allowed the people to tell their story. But our standpoint always has been, it's an incredible period of time, and what these labels achieved in a really short period of time, to me, it's much more akin to an art movement than commercial business.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think as a reader, you never feel like you're being taken in one direction or the other, or forced into something. It's absolutely up to you to. I'm interested though, Grant, that you said you've got loads of other footage and interview, so you could come up with a completely different version of the same book.
I think you could, and you know, because although, you know, what we'd have to do is like, I think Simon Reynolds actually did it, is we'd have to have every interview transcribed, you know, words for words, because, you know, Douglas Neil and myself and the people at White Rabbit, we've been allowed to edit somebody's story. So while it's truth, it's not the truth.
Yeah, sure.
And we could remix it again and again. For Big Old Dream, Eric Sandberg and myself, we did a lot of the interviews, and our editor Angela Slavin put them together, and then I would sort of backtrack to and forth with her to get one side of the story. And then when Douglas was doing the book, he took a lot of the source interviews, and it's like his interpretation of that. So there are differences between Big Old Dream and Hungry Beat, which I find fascinating. For me to read it, it's it messes with my mind, because I've interviewed these people 15 years ago, and we've made a film 7 years ago from that. And when I'm reading what Douglas is sent, and the drafts, I don't know what's real or not. It all sort of come, isn't sort of miasma. So I've got for me, I've got my own sort of remix of all sort of 3 versions together. And without a doubt, if you asked Malcolm, somebody else, anyone, their recollections of what they read in the book would be different. So you could remix again and again and again, and you'd have different answers. And we've also got to think of when we did it, people's answers will vary on what year you interview them, and it's fascinating, and you'll never get to the truth, but I think that's a good thing. We've got to have a myth as well.
And Neil, I just wanted to ask you about the importance of journalism at the time, because you mentioned, or Douglas mentioned, the Bluebell's been on the Melody Maker cover, and it was a really important thing as well, wasn't it?
Yes. I mean, the music press at the time was, it was hugely influential. Again, it's easy to forget. Now we can just pull anything off the internet. That getting the NME, Sounds, Melody Maker, Record Mirror, which were the 4 papers at the time, getting them every week, and there were you picked up on particular writers. Paul Morley in the NME, or Dave McCulloch in the Sounds, who are the ones who seem to be on the pulse. They wrote about the postcard bands and the fast product bands and the factory bands and the zoo bands, and and that was hugely influential in itself. And for someone who was just that bit too young to go out and see bands live, that was all you got, and that was your clue. That and John Peel, and that was what made you go to the record shops and then pick up the fanzines, which opened. It was it allowed you to go that little bit deeper. And it was. I mean, what they wrote in that kind of flamboyant way, that was allowed then in ways that I'm not sure really happen anymore. Possibly for the better. And it was hugely influential. They sold tons of copies. And which is interesting to think about as well. But I mean, that was part of it, because the whole thing about, I mean, so what Douglas was saying before, the thing about Postcard and Fast was their long-term influence on not just music but on pop culture in general. I think has been huge. What they did, and what reading about them, listening to them, going to see them, it was full of ideas, and it gave those consuming them ideas as well, and that has fed into everything that has followed, musically and culturally, I think.
Yeah, because I think I was the same as you. I would have favourite writers, so if they were writing about a band, I would then check out that band because they did it. And going on to what you said earlier about them seeming bigger than it actually was, I think the weekly music press fed into that, because you were reading national newspapers and there were bands, from just down the road or whatever.
Well, this is it. I mean, but you would read about. I remember reading about Felt and loving Felt, and I think they were amazing. And I went to see them, and there was about 50 people there. And you think, well, it's like they were the music press, because so it was both big and small. It had a huge influence on a certain pocket of people who were lapping it up. but it didn't go into the mainstream like it later did when people started signing to major labels and everything.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm aware that time's cracking on. I could talk to you about this for much, much longer, but thank you so much to all three of you for taking the time to have a chat.
Well, thank you, Alistair.
Thanks for inviting us.
It's
It's
been
an
a joy.
absolute pleasure. And yeah, best of luck with Hungry Beat. I think it's a terrific book and I hope it reaches its audience.
Thank you.
Much.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. Cheers.